Good morning, everyone. I'm so sorry I could not find my laptop charger for the life of me, but I really
Morning.
apologize.
Morning, Counselor.
Good morning. All right, I'm ready to go. I'm so sorry to keep everyone waiting.
Clearing the screen, ready to go when you are, Madam Chair.
All right, thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. We will virtually gavel to order on our hearing today in the City Council's Committee on Post Audit and Oversight. Docket number 0220 regarding green and social bonds. My name is Michelle Wu. I am chair of this committee, and I'm joined by my colleague, Councillor Kenzie Bach, who is the co-sponsor on this hearing. Let me just make sure. Oh, I see some others in the waiting room. Let me just see if this is. I see a Frank. Is that Councillor Baker, Frank, or a different Frank?
Yeah, hi, different Frank.
Oh, okay, hello, good morning. So just Councillor Bach with us so far from our council colleagues. If others join, we will recognize them as they join. A few disclosures at the beginning. This public hearing is being recorded and live streamed on the city website. It will be rebroadcast on Xfinity Channel 8, RCN Channel 82, FiOS Channel 964. We will take public testimony throughout the hearing. If you wish to testify by video conference, please email cora.montrond, MONTROND @boston.gov, Cora, CORA.montrond@boston.gov for the link. When you are called, please state your name and affiliation or residence and limit your comments to no more than 2 minutes. You may also submit written testimony by emailing ccc.pa@boston.gov. We are conducting today's hearing virtually in accordance with the state's rules and adjustments to the open meeting law. And I will create space now for my co-sponsor, Kenzie Bach, to give a short opening statement. I will follow suit and then we'll dive right in.
Great. Thanks so much, Councillor Wu. And thanks to the whole ANF team, Chief Handy and Mr. Starrett and Mr. Smith for joining us today. I ended my night last night on a hearing with Chief Handy, and here we are in the morning. So it's really appreciate all your work. I think that this is an opportunity to celebrate the really major offering that the city had back in December. I think that's something the council's, excited about and looking to hear more about, very much with an eye, as the hearing order says, to sort of growing these categories going forward. And I think that growing our green and social bond offerings would be the right thing to do, sort of regardless, because of just the need for us to spend in those categories of capital in order to actually reach our aggressive climate goals, and to, I think, really revolutionize the way that we think about housing as a public good in this city. And I think we've taken really important steps in terms of putting that in the capital budget over the last few years, but there's opportunity to crack that wider open. So I think it would be programmatically important anyways, but obviously if there's actually an opportunity to also achieve a pricing benefit, that's all to the better and increases our bonding capacity overall. So excited to hear more on that front, and grateful to Councillor Wu for her partnership on this. Thanks, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Bach. Looking forward to hearing from our colleagues at the administration. We know that last December, the city saw its first ever round of green and social bonds, and looking forward to getting into the details of that, as well as understanding what the future plans will be and projections of how we could use this tool moving forward to even continue deepening our commitment to affordable housing and climate resiliency. We know that the goals for affordable housing must be ambitious, and that housing stability remains the preeminent challenge across so many of our communities. And so when we're able to really lean in on the public side and use every tool that we have, love to get into the nitty gritty a little bit about understanding the relationship between Boston's bond rating, our debt limits, these specific types of bonds, and what we could do moving forward. So at this point, I'll hand it over. We have 3 speakers who are confirmed as panelists this morning. Of course, our Chief Financial Officer, Emma Handy, our Senior Deputy Treasurer, Drew Smith, Justin as well. Okay, so 4, Emma, Drew, Justin, as well as David Levy from the Center for Sustainable Enterprise and Regional Competitiveness at UMass Boston. So maybe if we could have our administration folks speak in whatever order combination, and then we'll pass it over. I know David has a little bit of a presentation for all of us.
Great. Thank you, Chairwoman Wu. Nice to see you all again. It was really nice to be with you last night, and pleased to be back again this morning talking about something that is as exciting and positive as our conversation last night around CPA grants. I'm really excited to talk a little bit about the 2020 bond sale for the city. I would be remiss if I didn't start by just extending my appreciation and gratitude to the city's finance team. The former Mayor Walsh liked to say that this was the best finance team in the country, and I agree with him because of the people that joined me on this panel today, Drew Smith and Justin Sterrett. They are phenomenal. They put together an incredible deal in December, a combination of an excellent, many years of excellent capital planning, as well as really strategic sort of go-to-market strategy for the city. And I'll allow Drew Smith to talk more about that after me. He was the architect of the deal and really put together a lot of the great principles around the green bonds and the social bonds that we will talk more about, and how that was sort of a competitive advantage for us this round. So many thanks to Justin and to Drew, to the teams at Treasury and OBM who support them, and all of the folks across administration and finance that have lent their expertise and their time to making the city of Boston such a strong, financially managed city. It really it pays dividends when we go to market, and we'll talk more about that as we talk about the bond sale. I'm so pleased to talk about this with you here today. And as I said, I'm going to let Drew do all of the talking because he really is the expert on sort of how we packaged and managed our sale and what the key strategies were that went into that. Happy to definitely talk more about future capital planning and the city's 7% debt limit, and how these types of sort of products fit into what that debt limit looks like and what the possibilities are for growth over time. So maybe we'll take those points and questions as follow-up from you counselors. And, you know, I just want to know that there were a lot of really wonderful things about the sale. It was a very positive event for the city of Boston. I think, as you mentioned, Chairwoman Wu, that the inclusion of green and social bonds was certainly one of the most notable aspects of it. But I do want to be careful to say that while this was the first time that the city had issued green bonds, it's certainly not the first time that we have funded green projects and programs in our capital budget. So it made sense based on the information that we had to sort of package them as a green bond, but certainly prior bond sales have allowed us to fund green projects across the city. And for several years, we've committed 10% of our capital plan to those green projects. And so just important to know that while it was the first time we did the bonds, certainly not the first time we funded those great projects. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Drew, who I think will just do some quick remarks on sort of what the deal meant for the city and how we approached it.
Great. Thanks very much, Emma. And thanks very much, counselors, for giving us the opportunity to talk about this. Talking about bonds is a great way to end a week, for me at least. It's one of our favorite subjects down here in Treasury, and particularly now since we did what we did with this last transaction. So as you'd mentioned, in December of 2020, the city issued its 2020 series of bonds. With this transaction, we accomplished a lot of the standard things that you want to accomplish with a transaction, but with great success. So we achieved a diversified coupon and maturity structure. We achieved a record low true interest cost at 1.22% for the city. And we locked in over $11 million in debt service savings that we'll experience over the next 13 years. I will say that we also did that with refinancing metrics that were twice as good as what you would normally consider a really good deal in a standard market environment. But I think it's important to note that, as you've mentioned here, that we did something different with this transaction. With this deal, we also advanced the cause of residents' access to these investments, to environmentally focused finance, and to equity. And I'd like to talk to you a little bit about that. So for the first time in what we estimate to be 20 years, the city issued its bonds through a negotiated method of sale. This allowed for the first time in just as long, small individual investors access to one of the city's primary offerings and to participate directly in those. In fact, the orders of local individual investors were given priority ahead of those of the larger institutional investors that frequently dominate competitive offerings. For the first time, Boston was able to choose its investment banking syndicate that would take it to market. And we're pleased to note that Siebert Williams Shank, a minority-owned investment bank, earned a position at the top of the transaction and co-led the deal. We were pleased to include Kestrel, a woman-owned firm, as our third-party green bond verifier, and ImageMaster, a minority-owned business, as our printer. For the first time, the city issued social bonds, as you've mentioned, with proceeds supporting phase 1 of the Bunker Hill housing development, a project undertaken in conjunction with the BHA, which is developing new units of affordable and mixed-rate housing. The proceeds of these bonds will also support the renovation of buildings in various elderly and disabled housing communities. For the first time, the City of Boston issued certified green bonds to fund projects such as the Renew Boston Trust, the construction of the Boston Arts Academy, a school that's being built to at least LEED Silver standards, and resiliency-focused renovations at the BCYF Curley Community Center and Langone Park. And with this green bond transaction, this is maybe one of the things that you've already heard about. The City of Boston broke new ground in demonstrating the largest, clearest pricing benefit to date for green bonds over their non-green or brown counterparts. It's our hope that others will follow in demanding their own green bond pricing benefit, with the ultimate goal of developing a market standard where we all just understand that green bonds price better than brown bonds. We believe that this is the best and quickest way to make issuing green bonds not simply a matter of policy preference or principle, but a clear dollars and cents decision and a fiduciary requirement for cities and states. Ultimately, driving up the cost of green bonds will drive down the cost of green infrastructure, and we think that that's the single best, fastest way to get more green done. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions you have.
Thank you. Will Justin want to add anything to that before we go to David?
Sure. I'll just very quickly add from a capital spending. Well, first I want to say, I think Emma gave Drew all the credit he should get, not only all the credit, but all the awards for this deal. I think nationally, I think this is an unprecedented type of deal for the sort of a municipal government to take this on. It's also, I think, as you mentioned, really combining three things all at once. One, a new bank focused on sort of equitable deal. That was a new deal for us this year. Also, the first green and social bonds, the first time in the city's history. And we got a good pricing benefit out of it too. So I think you could sort of knock this, you could sort of put this deal up there with some of the best deals in the country. And I think it would stand up pretty well. And that was all thanks to Drew and the team in Treasury and our banking partners who delivered that for us. So kudos to Drew for that. From a capital spending perspective, the city in the last capital plan, the 21-25 capital plan, was the largest plan in history. We had planned to borrow somewhere around $200 million, and we achieved that goal for the 2020 deal that we just had. It is the largest plan in history, and it certainly supports sort of robust spending going forward. I know one of the questions out there is how does the 5.4% of sort of debt as a percentage of the capital plan, of the operating budget, compared to our 7% threshold? The capital plan actually budgets for and plans to fully expend that 7%. The difference is that when we actually go to market, we are sort of legally required to only spend it on projects that are either in the ground or sort of that have immediate spending in the near future. As many of you know, the capital plan is dependent on a lot of different factors when it comes to actually building the projects, designing the projects, planning the projects, permitting the projects, and many of the really ambitious plans we have. A great example would be the sort of Long Island Bridge. They run into challenges when it comes to delivering those projects, and there are oftentimes challenges that are far outside the city's control. So we have a fully planned 7% capital plan, and it's on a yearly basis and honestly a monthly basis that we're reevaluating where we are relative to the 7% threshold. And we are sort of always trying to maximize it. And I think that will be the goal going forward into future capital years. So that's all I'll say right there, and then happy to take any questions.
Thank you. And I want to recognize also that Councilor Julia Mejia is with us today too. Okay, David, please go ahead. And did you need to share your screen? Oh, you're muted, David.
Unmute. There we are. Just to introduce myself, my name is David Levy, professor in the College of Management at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. and also one of the founders of the Sustainable Solutions Lab, and have been very closely involved with the Climate Ready Boston project, which University of Massachusetts and the Barr Foundation have been working closely with the city over the last few years. I'll share the screen and hopefully you can see this. If I go to full screen, there we go. And so, yeah, this is the report that I led, the Financing Climate Resilience. And the focus here was climate resilience, but speaking with Tally Robbins, she suggested that the intersection here was really important. And so I'm going to try and bring out some of these connections. So let me check that I can advance it. Yeah, one of the first things to emphasize is that we can't afford to do nothing here. The costs of inaction are very high. This is a national cost that was estimated in 2017, over 300 billion in damage to the US from weather-related disasters. And you're familiar with these scenes, particularly from downtown. And the Climate Ready Boston assessments looked particularly at the exposure and vulnerability of Boston. And what you can see here is this is an estimated annualized cost under various estimates of sea level rise. So going from 9 inches, 21 to 36, at 36 inches, which is maybe an estimate past the 2070s, we're looking at an average annual cost of over $1.5 billion a year to the city. And a lot of that is damage to buildings as well as business interruption. When I look at this, I actually think that this is a very conservative estimate. The losses are actually likely to be much bigger than this for various reasons. Sea levels are actually rising much faster than even when these reports were first prepared in 2016. It also assumes that there won't be any new property built and that prices won't rise in Boston. It's sort of a static picture, which obviously isn't very realistic. It also doesn't account for the kind of systemic citywide impacts that we see when there are major disasters and the communications and the power and the transportation go down. This is based more on insurance estimates at building by building. Anyway, the broad picture is this is somewhat of an underestimate, and it's an average. This could be many years without damage and then a big storm with many tens of billions of damage, just to be clear on that. A little bit more detail on sort of the number of buildings during different time periods that are exposed. About 2/3 being residential, you can see, and getting towards mid-century, we're looking at around 10,000 buildings exposed, about 2/3 of them residential, and they do tend to be in the poorer, the lower income neighborhoods. And I haven't got time to go into all the details. There's more in the report, but under different scenarios, the 1% flood, the 10% flood. But what we're realizing is that what we used to think of a 1% flood, something that might happen one in 100 years, those floods are actually happening every 10 years or every 3 years. So we have to recalibrate what these percentages actually are. And we don't have all that information because it's changing so quickly. I did want to emphasize the impact on municipal finances here, again, of doing nothing, of all the various costs that the city would likely incur in the event of a major flood. We've seen minor ones, we haven't seen the big one, as it were, not just for the repairs to the buildings, but the emergency services. Some of the things that weren't counted in those assessments were the lost tax and fee revenues from buildings that are lost, and that's been very significant after Katrina and Sandy, in New Orleans and New York, lost significant chunks of their tax base. Loss of inward investment. People aren't going to be investing here if they're worried about their supply chains and their transportation being disrupted. People are likely to leave. The longer term disruption to business. For the people in charge of capital planning, it's important to note that S&P and Moody's, the bond rating agencies, are beginning to take note of climate risks. S&P saying that climate risk is likely to have a much stronger impact. They're going to be assessing at the city and state level climate risks as they come to bond rating. So if we want to sustain our AAA bond rating and keep those interest rates low, it's going to be important to address these things. proactively. Part of what I'm summarizing here is the amount of investment that's needed to protect these areas. This is an example from East Boston, the picture at the top. The part of Climate Ready Boston has been a matter of going district by district and doing some planning and getting some estimates of what the costs for some of the major projects to protect these areas will be. And this is primarily from sea level rise, storm surge, right? We're not talking about energy efficiency and getting to zero carbon in Boston. That's going to be more expensive again. So just on the climate resilience, the initial estimates here are something like anywhere between 750 and 1.5 billion over the next few decades, taking us towards mid-century for these districts. Okay. But this is also a big opportunity, and what we like to emphasize, it's not just the costs, that there's an opportunity here. If we're going to be spending $1 billion or more to make the city climate resilient, there's an opportunity to integrate this also with energy efficiency as the city wants to move towards net zero carbon, but also with equity goals, and to design in affordable, resilient housing. If we can design housing and public spaces from the outset that are resilient to climate change, that are energy efficient, it's going to be much cheaper. And we can design by and for the communities to design in community resilience. And in a moment, we'll see this important link between community resilience and the physical resilience of the infrastructure. For retrofits, it's important to bring these together as well in terms of reducing the costs, because retrofitting just resilience or energy efficiency by themselves can be relatively expensive. But the big saving here, one way in which it helps to make housing more affordable, is the reduction in utility bills as well as insurance. You know, the green bonds reduce interest rates a little bit, and you know, that's important, but the bigger impact in the city is by keeping the city affordable, vibrant economically, as well in terms of community, and by reducing costs, both for businesses and for individuals to be living here, by keeping energy costs low. So there's this opportunity to revitalize the city, its infrastructure, and we shouldn't forget that there is, to the extent to which there's local investment here, we should focus as well on local employment and workforce training, seeing this as a whole package of investment. I know the green and climate bonds are the green and social bonds are one piece of that. I also wanted to emphasize this link between climate resilience and community cohesion, right? When communities are washed away, we've got this little picture of a house. A house might be resilient on stilts, but there's no community there. And there have been several reports. There's been quite a bit of research showing the importance of this soft infrastructure, the organizations, the data, the networks, the software that bond communities together, the kind of cohesion that comes from trust and communication and cooperation. But that needs to be built and invested in and designed for. As I said, there's quite a lot of academic research showing that in the various disasters that we've seen from Chicago to New Orleans and New York, New Jersey area, that the communities that are more cohesive actually survive much better and bounce back much more quickly. And that's actually a lot cheaper to do in some ways than the physical infrastructure, although it does take more concerted effort. Wanted to emphasize as well the return on investment from resilience investments and green buildings. So this is the value of being green. If we say that the PV, the present value of inaction, the cost of inaction, is up to 10 billion if we use a relatively low interest rates of today, the discount rates, over the next, well, till the end of the century. Green buildings, especially new buildings, are relatively cheap to build. It only adds another couple of % to the cost of the building, but they do generate a rent premium. And this is talking a little bit more about the commercial sector, perhaps, of anywhere between 6 and 12%, as well as lowering insurance and energy costs. So there's a very strong business case for building multifamily residential and commercial buildings green from the outset, and that's integrating climate resilience, the physical resilience with energy efficiency. The case isn't quite as good for retrofits or for district level investments, but we do have decades to be doing this. I mean, this is obviously a lot, rebuilding the city isn't just a short-term issue. Over here on the left, this is just excerpted from some of these district level reports. I just wanted to draw your attention to the very high benefit cost ratios of investing in resilience. They do the estimated costs, the projected benefit in terms of buildings that won't be washed away, won't be damaged if we do these resilience investments. But one thing that's really important to draw your attention to, you'll note that in the downtown area, we end up with a very, very high benefit to cost ratio, a much lower ratio in the more modest neighborhoods of the city. And what I want to point out is that we shouldn't just rely purely on cost benefit analysis, because it gets biased towards the wealthier, more affluent areas of the city. We also have to factor in that we want to protect the health and buildings and communities in lower income neighborhoods, because the benefit cost ratios aren't going to look so good. The same cost of protecting a neighborhood is going to show a much higher benefit in the wealthier neighborhoods. And so, we could potentially get misguided there into only protecting the wealthy areas. The report that I led does compare all the different types of financing. I'm not going to go into this in detail, the different ways in which comparing bonds and green bonds and other kinds of fees as a way of funding this. It may be a little less relevant now. I can always send you a link to this report. It's available on our Sustainable Solutions Lab website. What I just did want to bring out is that it's important to be thinking about equity as the city develops a financing strategy. There are different components of equity here. On the one hand, there's fairness, which means that the cost burden should broadly reflect the benefits provided. Bonds don't necessarily achieve that. We're all paying for the finance on the bonds. And those who are more protected near the ocean aren't necessarily paying any more. So there's a fairness issue, there's an equity issue, which means that the cost burden ought to reflect ability to pay. And that comes a little bit through property taxes, perhaps, and the cost of rent, but it's relatively indirect. One of the main suggestions in the report was to spread the cost burden through bonds, which are obviously the mainstay for this, but also to be thinking about different levels, some state funding on the one hand, but also at the district level. Districts which are in the front line are being primarily protected should also have some funding mechanism that would kick in particularly for resilience funding. And so we need to think about financing mechanisms that don't exacerbate the inequalities. A little bit, just wrapping up here, a particular suggestion around incentivizing the building retrofits was expanding the Mass Save program, or thinking of a slightly different program. You're all familiar with the Mass Save program that works for energy efficiency, but something similar for resilience, that there would be a funding pool, potentially from power bills, electricity bills, potentially on water or some other metric, where there would be a fund that would subsidize resilience retrofits, and maybe combining these together. Okay, and thinking about district level funding and how that might work on some kind of risk-based charge. I know that's not quite what the climate bonds and the social bonds are about, but various sources of funding are going to be needed to be combined to achieve the energy efficiency, zero carbon, as well as the resilience goals. The very last slide here is just emphasizing, again, that raising money for climate resilience, whether that's through green bonds and social bonds, going into affordable housing, as well as into protecting the city, we can keep the costs down for doing that by ensuring that the city is resilient. And we can potentially issue insurance that will will ensure that these projects get completed and that the city will be protected and will be financially secure, and that might also be able to help to keep the cost of financing down. So there's a mutual benefit by combining insurance and resilience. Anyway, the report goes into that in more detail. I'm just going to wrap up and say thanks very much, and also open to questions. So I will stop sharing.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for this opportunity.
We appreciate it. I also want to recognize that Councillor Liz Braden has joined us as well. Okay, at this point, we'll go into questions from councillors. I'll hold mine for the end. So we'll start with Councillor Bach, then Councillor Mejia, and then Councillor Braden.
Great. Thank you so much, Councillor Wu. I guess a first question, and it's really for the whole team, is, I'm curious, Drew, you mentioned sort of reaching the LEED silver with one of these buildings, and I'm sort of curious in understanding, like, does the market yet have a clearly established standard for what counts as green, or are we kind of in the middle of helping to create that, or how did you sort of land there?
So I will say that the market's getting there. It knows, it can more clearly tell you what's not green. We do know that LEED silver does meet the general standard that most certifiers will accept when they're determining whether a bond is green or not. So that was we took a little bit of guidance from Kestrel as we were doing that, just to double check ourselves to make sure that we were including projects that would pass muster. One of the reasons, the $25 million in green bonds actually supported $32 million in spending, and that was spread over a number of different projects. The thing that you'll find in common with all those projects is that they really represent the deepest shade of green that we had that were shovel ready. And as Emma had mentioned earlier, we've been doing a lot of green projects already, but we were trying to accomplish a couple of different things with this green bond transaction, and we thought it would be easiest to include the deepest shade. So there's not a clear answer yet. It's really whatever the certifiers say they are and whatever the investors are willing to accept, but we know LEED silver does it.
Yeah, and I guess in terms of thinking about that deepest shade, like, my hope would be that we would grow this category and that we would make some distinction internally between kind of, there's green projects that, reach green building standards, and that's great because those buildings are going to be more resilient in the long term, and we know where we need to go with emissions. But then there's also, like, the kind of green infrastructure projects that that really move the needle more dramatically in terms of, like, actually reaching our climate ready Boston goals. And it seems to me like I want us tagging everything we think the market will give us a pricing benefit on as green, but I don't want us distracted by that tag in terms of what the difference is between things that, like, actually move us to climate goals versus things that kind of meet somebody's standards somewhere.
Can I just jump in there, Counselor? Because I think that's a great point. And I think the facilitation of revenue to support our green projects is obviously it is the reason why the green bonds are important, but they do not sort of supplant or rise above the green goals of the city of Boston, right? So to exactly your point, like, the projects need to be driven by the strategic planning around climate ready Boston and what all of the departments are doing. And how we pay for it is the part that the three of us are responsible for. And it is beneficial, and I think a very positive thing that we have a specific avenue to help us do that in the green bonds. But I think exactly to your point, like, we need to be doing the projects that are the most important, and those are the projects that walk with our long-term planning about climate change, and not just projects to make the numbers work on the back end.
Right. And I just think that the climate world has already in many ways moved beyond LEED certification. And if the financial world is still there, like, that's great from a pricing perspective. But I guess, what I wouldn't want us to do is get to this place where sort of our benchmark is 10% of our portfolio this, and then, and so we're kind of using what I like a sort of low bar for what counts towards that 10%, because obviously the real question isn't, are we doing 10%? The real question is, can we get there from here in terms of our climate goals? So I just wanted to register that.
If I could jump in on that as well, there are a number of metrics being developed both on the climate resilience side and energy efficiency that go beyond LEED, and that the idea is to have metrics at the building level. Some states and cities are mandating this, and the idea is it will affect the market price, right? So that there'll be a price premium on these buildings that will reflect the discounted insurance or the lower utility bills. And so they're meant to help the market work better and to provide those signals. I think National Institute for Insurance, can't remember the exact thing, but they're developing a set of metrics as well for buildings. So in addition to LEED, there are these metrics available and that can be mandated.
Great, thanks.
And I just think the example of Boston Arts Academy, right? We were going to build the Boston Arts Academy. And so the reason it's a green project is because rather than just build it to the bare minimum, it is going to be a spectacular project in many different ways, including, at least silver LEED. And I know that there's hopes that they can get to a higher rate. And so the reason that that works in this context is because the project was going to happen already, but we are of course paying a premium to make sure that we're not just building buildings that are sort of at a baseline that don't rise to the times in terms of being contemplative of climate change.
If I could just add quickly, it's also about context and what the city is building versus what the market generally probably needs to build. A lot of what Mr. Levy mentioned was stuff that's going to involve the state and private enterprise. The city is responsible for maintaining and building its own assets. So while the BAA, as Emma mentioned, we're building to a green standard, there are sort of projects in this initial bond, like the Curley Center, which is right on the water, or the Renew Boston Trust, which is retrofitting city buildings to make them energy efficient, or something more climate resilient like Lango and Popolo Park, which is right on the water, and we built climate specific aspects to protect the neighborhoods behind it. We're sort of limited in our scope of what we're ever going to be able to do there because of the coordination, because of frankly the sheer sort of cost of building climate resilient. I could see it in your background, the beautiful Columbia Point and Carson Beach. Those are all state assets at the end of the day. So we're going to need both private and state participation, and frankly, probably federal participation, in order to make the vast investments that are going to be needed to protect that. And we're sort of just only able to do what we're able to do with our own assets.
And our big pieces down that end on these fronts are going to be Moakley Park and the housing developments. One more question, Madam Chair. I do have further, but I'll yield after that. But just to Justin, the point about sort of, we budget for 7% and we don't get there. I guess the place that I find myself on that is kind of, well, if I were admitting a class to a college, I would admit a bunch more people than I had spots, and I would have sort of like long-term historical analysis of how many of these people are going to take my spots and be kind of playing a game there to get as close as possible. Similarly, I find myself wondering why, when we have the bonding sort of authority and capacity with our policy limit, we're not kind of starting the wheels spinning on a larger number of projects with some kind of sense. Because even though each project's reason why it doesn't get off the ground in the fiscal year is special, if we zoom out, right, there are certainly trends, and we can kind of guess about how things are going to go at the macro level. And it seems to me like we could be getting more of those plates spinning in order to get closer to 7%, except if the thing that is just the ultimate limit is our public facilities capacity, in which case it seems to me that we should be increasing that. So I want to raise that because I don't feel like we have to be permanently shooting for the 7% moon and always landing below.
Sure. Great points. Let me take a step back. In the capital plan, we plan to ramp up borrowing. So just let me give you a little bit of context in this last capital plan. Between FY21 and 2025, we plan on ramping up capital borrowing on the GEO side from about 200 million to about 280 million, which is a tremendous increase in the amount of borrowing we would be doing year over year. We have a sort of a fiduciary responsibility to our credit rating agencies and to our bondholders that we can't go out there and sort of signal necessarily that we're going to exceed our bond threshold, because then that puts us at risk for either having to delay a project that's in the ground, right? So all of a sudden, if all those projects hit at the same time, and we would have to choose sort of between which projects we're going to stop midstream versus which ones we're going to continue. So we'd want to continue to do that. With that said, we do make use of all the tools in our tool belt to try to maximize that 7% threshold within sort of the existing revenue limits we have. So by that I mean we sort of offset savings for the Renew Boston Trust. We sort of offset savings that we know, whether it's Drew's pricing benefits or whether it's the market generally because of our AAA bond rating. I think we're certainly investing about as much as possible. The other flip side of the equation is, as you mentioned, capacity to actually implement those projects. And there is certainly always a need for more project managers. And we've worked really closely with both PFD, but also parks and transportation to get more bodies to deliver more projects. The city is just also sort of still coming out of what was a sort of a dynamic in the 2010s, sort of right at the last recession, where we basically, the city made a decision to stop spending on the capital plan basically, or sort of drastically reduce what we were planning to spend. And it's taken basically the last decade to build up that capacity, both from a sort of a project management perspective, but also just we can't have 10 libraries offline at one time. We can't have multiple BCYF centers off at one time. We can't repave every road in the city. Not that traffic is great now, but imagine having traffic in that capacity. So we are working on that, and that's sort of been a priority, is to sort of grow the capacity to deliver those projects. But it's always a balancing act, right? And it's always trying to determine how much we can get done with the legal limits and how much we can get done with sort of our financing ability. And we're certainly trying to push the needle on that.
Great, thanks.
Can I just add one thing? I'll be brief. I just want to underline, I think, those points by Justin, that we are very much in that phase of getting to that right balance to be at the 7%, right? To Justin's point, it's taken many, many years to do that. And these last several years in particular, we have very intentionally added resources to be able to be sort of hovering at much closer to that 7%. But exactly to your point, Counselor, if we go over the 7%, which is a risk, right, that the ability to come back under is a real challenge. So that multi-year look is exactly what needs to be applied, because we don't want to have to stop projects in the middle and leave holes in the ground because we've exceeded our responsible borrowing, which has obviously detrimental effects down the line. Now, 7% is eminently achievable. We want to get there. We're going to get there. We've been ramping there, as Justin said, for the last decade, and much more seriously, I would say, in the last several years. And so there's no reason why we shouldn't be there, but I do think, it is an important fiscal principle for the city, and it's something that we need to be mindful of as we manage, because, and certainly, right, the 7% itself is something that is up for discussion, but it is something that the city is lauded for, and it's important that we have some principle there to make sure that we are borrowing responsibly, because a lot of cities, that is their sort of fiscal downfall, is that they overshoot on that. And I think, to Justin's earlier point, the types of goals that we're talking about on resiliency in Boston are going to require massive federal infusion of resources, a ton of collaboration with the state, lots of participation, as the professor said, from private industry, right, through things like possibly bids and things like that. So I think it's a mosaic of resources, certainly, that will help us meet these goals.
Great,
Thank
thanks.
you. Great. I want to recognize that Councillor Flynn has been with us for a while as well. Welcome, Councillor Flynn. And so the order is Councillor Mejia, then Braden, then Flynn. Councillor Mejia.
Hello, yes. Thank you, Chair, and the sponsors for calling this hearing. I'm just really excited to be here. This is an area that I think a lot of the folks who are tuning in are learning lots. So lots of really good information. I do believe, I just have a few questions because I think that through these green bonds, we have an opportunity to address some of the systemic health problems and climate changes that predominantly communities of color are impacted by. So I'm just curious when it comes to, when it comes to supporting future large-scale developments. You could take it out of the plan now. When it comes to supporting future large-scale developments for green housing, I'm wondering how are we going to go about ensuring that we're creating space for Black and Brown contractors to access these development projects? That is hot. Oh. Sorry, my daughter's trying to cook while I'm trying to talk. So I'm gonna listen to your answer, and then I have another question, okay? Sorry.
Thank you, Counselor.
So the question is about how we're gonna utilize this opportunity for Black and Brown contractors in these new development projects.
Great.
The highest one, at least.
Great, thank you. So I'll start by just mentioning that the city's ability to invest in housing through our capital plan is relatively limited because of the restrictions on sort of what municipalities can do with capital funding in Massachusetts. We are very much restricted to affordable housing, and actually we've only just dipped our toe into that in the last year or so. And we have done that through our partnership with the BHA to help them to renovate and bring back online new units for developments that are definitely past their prime and are desperately in need of some rehabilitation or just entirely new construction for their residents. And so that is really our focus. We work closely with BHA on that. We've dedicated a great deal of resources, both between the city's capital plan, the Winthrop Square garage, as well as the projected future sale of the Lafayette garage, will all allow us to invest with BHA to do these types of projects with them. So it is definitely a sort of limited way in which we can generate resources for housing because we are so restricted in sort of how we do that. But I would defer to our colleagues at BHA, their separate entity, and sort of what their contracting process.
All right, one second, Emma. One second, Emma. Councilor Mejia, there's just a lot of feedback coming from your end. If you can. Great, thank you.
Thank you. I'm certainly happy to follow up with BHA and get you answers, Councilor Mejia, about sort of how they construct these large development deals, because they are obviously very large and complex. And actually maybe Kenzie would like to weigh in here and add, but I do know that the BHA has participated in with the city on some of our contracting reforms and thinking about disparities and doing that work alongside of us. Obviously they purchase very different things than the city does. And so I think I would be happy to follow up and get some more direct information from BHA about what exactly that looks like for them.
I was wondering, since you deferred to our fabulous Ways and Means Chair, Kenzie, Councilor Bach, are you asking her to weigh in? Because I do have a follow-up question, Councilor Bach, and I'm not the chair of this. So I don't want to facilitate this conversation. So I don't know what that was all about. So
why don't you go for your follow-up, Councilor Mejia? That sounds great.
Okay, thank you. So I'm just curious, in terms of I know you're going to get back to us on kind of the contracting piece. And it's not just for BHA and affordable projects. I'm also curious about what that looks like for other types of, projects outside of the scope of this. I was just seeing if there were any opportunities. Jesus Lord, are we looking for other opportunities outside of that space? And then how are we prioritizing the retrofitting of houses in neighborhoods that have experienced disproportionate health impacts as a result of climate change, and as we think about this particular opportunity?
Thank you, Councilor. We are not doing any projects with city bonded funds to retrofit housing. That is an area for us that we do not have a clear indication that we are able to use city bonded funds to do that. And so I think that's an area for future growth. It's certainly something that I think the Biden administration has expressed interest in investing in. It's an area that, the state is contemplating as well. And I think it is a place where that is that mosaic of funding that I think we would need to see come to fruition, because as Justin said, our resources are really focused on the assets that the city owns. We are relatively limited in our ability to spend money beyond what our city owned parcels. Most of our affordable housing funding does not come from our capital budget. Historically, none of it has come from our capital budget. It is very new that we've put any of our money into affordable housing, and we've really only done that with BHA because they are another governmental partner, and that's what allows us to do that. Your question on sort of what opportunities in the city's contracting is certainly one that the city is actively working on right now. As I'm sure you know, we recently finished our disparity study, which has given us some indication about sort of how the city can move forward to do race and gender conscious measures in our contracting, which would apply as well to capital projects. So I think we will have much more to say about that very soon in terms of how the city plans to incorporate that into both our capital plan as well as our operating spending.
Great. Do you have more on your list, Councilor Mejia?
No, thank you very much. I'm all set. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Braden, you're up.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I apologize. I was slightly late, so I missed a chunk of the presentation. So I may be, and I will review the tape later. I really applaud this initiative. I'm very excited about the potential to expend funds on green infrastructure, green projects. And I know it. In terms of what properties, assets the city can actually invest in, can you just clarify for me which projects are eligible and or potentially eligible, and which would be excluded? Is it really just school buildings and possibly housing in partnership with BHA? Are there other infrastructures projects that would qualify?
Generally, it is anything that the city owns. And so we've sort of been able to extend that by working in partnership with the BHA because they are another local government entity. But Drew, do you want to say a little bit more about what governs the spending through the city's?
Sure. So it comes from a couple of different places. The question of how you can issue bonds, whether tax exempt or taxable, is really a matter of federal regulation. The question of whether or not we as a city in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts can issue bonds for a specific purpose has a lot to do with what the state constitution allows us to do. The primary rule is that it does have to be for a public purpose, but there are still restrictions within that. As Justin and Emma had indicated, this is really the first time that we've done it for affordable housing, even though we are allowed to, under the Constitution, bond for affordable housing. When you get a little bit further out than that, it becomes really more of a matter of getting an opinion from your bond counsel. So we work really closely with them on determining that. I'm not a constitutional scholar, so I wouldn't be able to say with any degree of certainty how far we could push it or go, but we know we can do affordable housing.
And I know the Boston Water and Sewer Commission is a separate agency, but I'm just curious, because I think in terms of resiliency and ability to handle an extreme weather event, such as a prolonged storm that drops a lot of rainwater on us with associated flooding, I'm wondering, would that agency be also qualify for these bonds, or is that? And I'm still not clear about the relationship between the Boston Water and Sewer and the actual city as well. You know, I know it's sort of decoupled some years ago, but how that relationship would play out in this scenario with regard to investment in green infrastructure.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. Water and Sewer has their own capital plan funded by their own revenue sources. Although I will say that Chief Cook and Chief Osgood in his former role work very closely with Water and Sewer on things like stormwater management, green infrastructure, et cetera. So Water and Sewer is managing their own, multi-year capital plan to address those issues for our streets and waterways. But it is obviously in close coordination with the city, the experts that we have involved in those topics. Justin, do you want to add anything to that?
I just double down. We do work very closely with them on there are some intersections of city projects and water and sewer projects. Like if we were to potentially use a city park as a sort of retainer for flood overflow or water overflow, that is a green solution to a water and sewer problem. That also has the benefit of sort of supplying a park with open space and climate resilience. So I think that we definitely partner with them. I'm looking outside my window right now at City Hall Plaza, where we are going to have a robust sort of runoff program with water that we've partnered with Water and Sewer, where we're sort of dedicating the vast majority of funding, and they're going to contribute some funding to help with some stormwater runoff there. So we definitely partner closely with them. But Emma's exactly right. They have their own capital authority and their own bonding authority that they use their own revenue to go out to market and buy every year.
So and then, out in Alston Brighton, I think stormwater management, we're not going to be inundated with seawater yet. So stormwater management, and then also the heat island effect. So retrofitting schools, is it more feasible to build new schools than to retrofit older schools? Some of them are 100 years old, not the most energy efficient, and certainly not well insulated from the terms of heat. I think the heat challenges are more of a challenge than the cold challenges, and air quality. So just a question in terms of priorities, would building a new school be a priority over retrofitting an older school?
So I think it's hard to answer that from just a sort of climate lens alone. The issue that we have with many of our schools is that they are, as you mentioned, very old, and therefore the space layout is typically not advantageous for the types of communities that we sort of want to build in our schools. And so if we had the option of just retrofitting from a sort of an energy and climate standpoint, a school so that it was modernized in that way and it worked for a school community, I think that would be very attractive for the city. But oftentimes it's that the building itself is not conducive for the sort of services and classes that the school wants to offer. And that's when we find ourselves in the situation of sort of needing to envision building a new school, which is also not straightforward because we are obviously in a urban city where there is not a lot of land available, and it requires things, as Justin was mentioning earlier, about sort of ability to flex into vacant buildings, et cetera. I mean, it's BPS has a difficult task in terms of figuring out just how to manage these things for their schools. But I think it is sort of within the broader context of like what is the need for the community as a whole, and then as we do build new buildings, we obviously are including these climate standards as part of it.
Very good. And I'm also curious about the LEED standard silver. That seems quite low. I'm just wondering, is that just sort of that's just the threshold? And obviously if people can go higher than that, that's great. But silver standard seems quite modest.
I'll just quickly add on that. I think we are trying to be as ambitious as possible with where we're dedicating city resources. At the end of the day, though, that's sort of an incremental cost above and beyond what we've already put into the BAA, for example, which is, I'm going to get my numbers wrong, I think is $125, $150 million school building. That is sort of less money that we would then be able to dedicate towards other retrofits and other school buildings or other, getting the, new projects like the JQUS or the Carter School up to that green that silver certification. So it's all a little bit about balancing priorities and balancing of ability. I would say that it is, while it is I would say it's probably lower on the end of the LEED certification scale. We didn't have to do that at all. And I think getting to that is going to be a real indicator of our sort of our ability and our willingness to invest in green. I think it's, it's all about going to be balancing priorities. I would go back to your earlier comment about, whether it's new schools versus retrofits. We've been investing pretty heavily in upgrading windows and boilers and energy efficiency at schools already, working in close partnership with the School Building Authority and their ARP program. We also view the Renew Boston Trust, where we've sort of focused a lot on other city buildings, whether they're, BCYF centers or libraries or fire stations on that first phase. We view the Renew Boston Trust as really the avenue to get into as many buildings as possible within city government, including the 125 schools that are out there. So I think it's there are going to be certain trade-offs that we have to make along the way for financial reasons, and we're going to sort of try to do both. Get as much as we can on the new builds, but also get into as many buildings as possible.
Thank you.
Was gold certified, so I think that's certainly the goal. It's just that it's sort of in the details of how we get there.
Very good. Madam Chair, I'm sure I've gone over time, so thank you. I may have another question if we have another round.
We'll have another round. Thank you very much, Councillor Braden. Councillor Flynn?
Thank you. Thank you, Councillor Wu, and thank you to the administration team that is here. Apologize for being late this morning. I had another meeting on veterans issues. So I just have one quick question. I know with the new proposal to build Josiah Quincy School, that was one of the issues we focused on, is making sure that school is healthy, it's environmentally friendly for the students and the school community, especially as it's pretty much right on top of the highway system, the Mass Turnpike. We know the high rate of asthma in the Chinatown community. I've worked with Councillor Wu on that issue, but Chinatown has the highest asthma rate of any neighborhood in the state. I guess my question is, I know some of this funding is coming from the Lafayette parking garage in the Millennium, some of those projects, the Millennium Project. But how are we going to use that funding to benefit some of the impacted areas in and around Chinatown or on the highway system, like Andrew Square, Roxbury, Dorchester? But are we able to use some of that funding to work on issues that historically haven't been addressed, such as environmental issues, and how we can improve the living conditions for residents, whether it's a school, whether it's a house, whether it's a city building?
Thank you, Counselor. I'll jump in and then maybe Justin will help me round out this answer. So I think on the Quincy School, certainly the goal is, again, to get to sort of something like gold certified. That seems to be the standard that BPS is trying to design to at this point. And as they get further along the design, they find out more about sort of how achievable that is for each. But I think that has been the goal, as you mentioned. The challenge on all of these things is, as Justin mentioned before, our ability to invest city capital dollars is somewhat restricted to sort of where our parcels of land are. And so thinking about sort of how do we get to those goals and get at those goals through the various places where the city owns either buildings or parks or whatever it may be. And I think certainly the goal of more trees, which is something we've invested in both on the operating budget as well as through the parks capital budget, it has been a major component of that. But I think you raise really important points about sort of how can we more broadly do that through what the city's capital budget is able to invest in. And again, I think unfortunately for something as something like climate, which is obviously everywhere in our city, but in particular affects certain areas more than others because of air quality and other things, the answer is always going to be that we have to leverage many different players and many different types of resources to get at it. Because, when we talk about the highway, obviously that is a state resource. We need state engagement to help us address that. We need federal money because frankly, federal money is where we can make the most transformative change because of the volume of change, but also because it typically comes with program parameters that sort of allow us to extend beyond what the city typical operating or capital budget would do. So it's really important that we are coordinating across all of those things to address some of the things that you're raising. Justin, anything to add on that?
The only thing I would add is sort of relative to Winthrop and future proceeds from garages is we used with the help of the council, the city used the proceeds of the Winthrop Square garage to make really transformative investments in areas of the city that I think required that type of big dollar investments. I'm thinking of the jewels of the sort of emerald necklace like Franklin Park or the Boston Common, and then big investments in housing, whether it's over in the BHA for Orient Heights or other developments that that funding was able to be used for. I think the goal of future anytime we dispose of a city asset, it's for a specific reason, and it's for investing in these types of one-off projects that require sort of transformative levels of investment, like a Lafayette Square garage, where we would sort of propose to likely dedicate that funding primarily towards housing, and that's housing in lots of areas of the city, to I think get at your concerns around the most impacted residents. And I think that's why we use those big assets for those types of purposes, is because otherwise we can't spend $25 million to redo Franklin Park or $25 million to redo the Boston Common, or major investments in housing in East Boston like Orient Heights. And I think that's sort of the framing anytime we think of disposing of a city asset, and that's likely that will likely be the sort of approach going forward.
And I should just clarify, Councillor, that none of this bond deal has any proceeds from surplus assets, right? Or from Winthrop Square or Lafayette, I should say. Winthrop Square went through the appropriation process with the council. Lafayette is not yet sold, and therefore we have not made any appropriation of those surplus funds. So we would come back to the council when we were ready to do that. Obviously, we've talked about sort of what the spending plan is that we had originally conceived with you all, but more to come on that.
Thank you. And I just have one final question. If you don't have an answer, if you're able to maybe do a little bit of research, do we have a comprehensive list of all city-owned property in Boston, or even in Greater Boston, whether it's owned by the city of Boston or any other city agencies such as the BPDA. Do we have a comprehensive list of that type of real estate?
Yeah, I think we certainly can. I don't have it in front of me, but yes, we certainly have an inventory of all of our assets. There are certainly some assets that are constantly evolving, and there are certain assets that you and I might consider sort of a piece of a road somewhere or a piece of a sidewalk that is always in flux depending on the construction season. But we certainly have an inventory of all of our properties that we can pull together.
Yeah, Justin, could you at some time over the next week or so, could you email that to me or send it down to me? Thank you, Councilor Wu.
Thank you, Councilor Flynn. Okay, back around to Councilor Bach.
Councilor Wu, did you want to?
I'll go after second rounds.
Okay.
I have a long list, but I think they're getting ticked through anyway.
Okay. Yeah, so I guess one question I had was whether we've looked at all at how the bond pricing benefits on the green and social side would interact with if we did choose in the future to do CPA bonding. Because obviously in the case of CPA bonding, you're bonding against the future CPA revenues. Two of the three categories that we would do that for are kind of green and social, right? It's housing and parks. I think obviously it runs into the same issues we've been discussing. You could only really do it for the stuff that's going to be public side. Although it's interesting because, well, that's actually the question, I guess, is that so CPA bonding seems to be usable for the things that CPA can pay for, including things that we wouldn't think our normal bonding could pay for. So that would be like an advantage. Then my concern, though, would be that we wouldn't have the same pricing benefits because they're not GO bonds and they're based on a revenue stream that is not as substantial as our position as a city. And so I'm just curious whether you guys have run down that road a little bit at all.
Well, Emma, do you want?
No, go ahead.
Well, I can tell you, you're exactly right. If we were so let's say we were issuing bonds for CPA funded projects and we were on the D&D side of things. So we're talking about affordable housing. I think it would make all the sense in the world to issue those as social bonds to the extent that we had open space kind of projects that we were bonding for. I think that that's a perfect type of project that we could issue. We could put the green label on. So I think we could certainly do that. I think you're also exactly right in that the borrowing cost is going to be different. Now, in theory, if the market evolves to the point that green bonds always have a pricing benefit over brown bonds, then your cost is going to be a little bit lower. But relatively, it could still be higher than the city's. City's AAA CPA may not be if it's under its own separate indenture. So you're right on both counts.
Okay. All right. And it might be then that it's a good thing to use for the categories that we can't do the basic bond plan in, but like, for the things that CPA can pay for that we can't on the GO.
I would also just throw out there, and we've talked about this a lot with CPA. It's about size and scope, right? So the reason you bond for anything is because you need a bunch of money upfront right away. If there was sort of a housing, because we still are investing obviously in open space and housing and all these other things in the annual CPA process, it's the sort of, is there that sort of fundamental or sort of, historic type investment that you want to make with, housing or open space money? Moakley Park jumps to mind, right? If you wanted to make $100 million investment in Moakley Park, that might be worth exploring. But on a sort of an annual basis, we don't have those types of, game-changing type investments that we are sort of ready to make as a city or prepared to make and then actually spend the money to back to our further conversation or earlier conversation. So I do think that it's all about sort of the timing as well. And that's something that I think is worthy of consideration when thinking about bonding for CPA.
Makes sense.
The last thing I'll add is just that the pricing benefit for the city of Boston is the city of Boston, right? So borrowing under our GO authority is what gives us the best pricing benefit, right? Because we are a AAA credit and everybody wants to be invested with Boston. The green designation is sort of the cherry on top, right? At least in terms of what happened this round. So things like doing a separate credit, which is something that the city has considered before, they don't, even if they're green, they're not going to be as good of a benefit as City of Boston GO borrowing because of the strength of our underlying credit. So it's just something to consider as we sort of put together this mosaic of resources. It doesn't always wash out in terms of the way that we think it might be favorable.
Right. Although I think there's an interesting question about would the market really regard if we issued CPA bonds, would it say, oh, that's only secured by their CPA revenue, or would it kind of say, well, the city of Boston is standing behind them, and might we actually have some of the benefits and pricing that we get from a GO bond? Because realistically, I might prognosticate that we wouldn't abandon our CPA offerings if the CPA revenue ran into trouble.
It would be, yeah, it's a good point. It would be viewed as having some type of implicit moral obligation that's not really kind of based in anything from a legal perspective. And so when you're going through these investors and their credit analysts, they're still looking at what the law actually allows, who the law actually allows them to go after if the bonds don't get paid. But you're right, to some extent, some would view that, the city of Boston might stand behind it, but legally, no, it would be separate.
Got it. And then another question, this is sort of a follow-up on the conversation we were having about getting to 7%. And I take the point about building towards capacity. I guess it seems to me that I still think that at the grand scale, you could do that multi-year analysis and run pretty comfortable that you weren't going to go over saying you accept the policy limit. But it also strikes me that we should be looking, and I've talked about this in other spaces, including on the sort of conservation core front, like we should be looking for types of capital work. Let's say like we get our urban forestry plan in and we're like, oh, we need to plant a hell of a lot more trees. Like types of capital work that we could scale up and down, like kind of as filler relatively quickly, and think about like what are the green opportunities there that are things where we could kind of halfway through the year be like, all right, like go. But I'm not sure, maybe it's not halfway through the year, maybe it's October because we're making the bond offering in December. I don't know, but I just wanted to sort of raise that as a question, because it seems to me like that's more it's more fungible than the like either the school is happening or it's not, like, right. And then so that's more of a comment if you guys have any comments in response. And then I just wanted to stress on the housing front, I mean, I think that the city's partnership with the BHA on housing is great. It was, in fact, the first context in which I met this team was trying to persuade you to do that. So I'm grateful. But I do, I think in the long run that Boston should be thinking about social housing on publicly owned land in a broader frame, like BHA housing. And then we could, if we owned it, we could mix in units that are at different income bracket levels. I mean, that's a more aspirational thing, but when you think about how to really anchor those kind of full mixed communities in the city, and you look at what our European counterparts do, and frankly, how our European counterparts turn the market income into something that funds the lower income stuff, and without doing it with a private pass through in a bunch of cases. There's a really good example of this in London. I think there's a lot of opportunity for us to think more capaciously. I think starting with, let's get the city in the habit of working on the BHA projects, and we have so much need there, makes good sense. And I think I've also been quite public about my hope that we could kind of marry the capital plan with a lot of federal public housing and ultimately RAD authority to have more public housing units in the city. But I just want to kind of say that I think that even within the constraints of the bond council, that there is a bunch more creatively that we could do on housing, and that in fact the main problem from a bond council perspective is affordable housing that's privately owned, which then just sort of points you back towards affordable housing that is publicly owned. So I just wanted to kind of underscore on both those fronts. If there are any comments, but
the only thing I would, I guess, add in response to that is to really fully sit in my CFO position is the need at BHA is so substantial that it would, the ability for the city's capital budget to absorb what BHA needs to bring their campuses sort of up to a modern standard, it's not achievable through city resources, right? And so that's where I think, as you said, Councillor, some federal resources, et cetera. We have been trying to make progress with BHA to address the most urgent needs and to give them some resources to help get some key projects off the ground. But we will not be able to, sort of, I love the idea of starting with BHA and building from there. We won't be able to finish BHA, right, in terms of city resources, because it's just overwhelming. And that used to be entirely, I know you'll probably correct me because I'll get some facts here wrong, and you obviously know this better than I do, but that used to be a federally funded program, right? There was no city resource that was committing capital to BHA. And so the fact that we've gone down this path is, I think, really needed and necessary, but it is certainly not something that the city can on its own take on the entire weight of, because it would overwhelm our capital plan. And we have to fix our roads and our sidewalks. We have to maintain our schools. We have to, keep up to speed on our BCYF centers. Like, there is some baseline stuff that nobody else is going to do. And unfortunately, that's why we stepped into the BHA space too, because all of a sudden nobody else was going to do that either. So I think it's a really excellent point. I think opportunities like CPA are a great place to look for sort of where can we do more. But I just want to caution that, the ability to even take on what BHA needs is just not something that the city can do alone.
Absolutely. And I fully intend to chase hundreds of millions of federal dollars to support this portfolio. I agree with you completely, Emma, but I guess what I would say is I still think that if we thought about this as a part of our portfolio, let's say that complemented by federal dollars, right? Because like you said, there's no way, right, with the backlog. I think we could think more, like, the reality is that we are now, like, the amount of income that you get from project-based vouchers in the city with our switch to small area fair market rents is substantial. It's something where that would be a public income stream that we could have units on public land that are absolutely paying their way, and you're not doing a big gap fill, but you might have to do some upfront stuff that you're then going to fund back. I think that, when we think about even a bunch of the public-private partnerships we're doing, I think Charlestown's really exciting, and I'm so glad it's in the social bond portfolio from December. I think like I said, in London, what they did long-term was to even move to the next scale, where instead of hiring a private developer to do that redevelopment and the cross-subsidization with the market, the housing authority hired architects and a builder, right? And then the private market rents are all kind of coming back to them in the long term for the project. I think there are things about the approaches that we are taking that we could ratchet up to like the next level of public led on the housing side, even within the constraints of the city's capital budget. So I just offer that as food for thought. And then also on the environmental side, I think looking for these scalable opportunities. I think we've been talking a lot, and I'll talk in other forums more about the kind of conservation core opportunities. But I still feel on the green side, I just feel like our 10% is great, but it's not going to get us here to there. So that's
just very quickly. Not only is it a sort of part of the capital plan we don't want to crowd out, it's also the operating budget, right? I know we talk a lot about, getting to 7%, but keeping up pace with that level of debt service requires debt service as an increase of the overall budget to represent a very large portion of all the new money we have coming into the city, right? So thinking about sort of the last couple of years, we've been adding $20 to $30 to $40 million worth of just debt service operating budget payments that are sort of trade-offs for other things on the operating budget. And I think that's certainly something that, both previous administrations and I know the Janey administration is interested in sort of using the capital plan and investing in the capital plan and using that as both a capital tool, but then also that's going to come from an operating budget cost at the end of the day. So it's definitely that going forward. And I think from the 10% is our goal. We've added more than 10% over the last couple of years for climate. So I think that that's certainly, again, the greenest of the green shades, as to use Drew's expression. But we're definitely trying to do as much as possible when it comes to that. But there are certainly going to be trade-offs in every scenario that we have.
No, absolutely. Yeah. And of course, I mean, the tricky thing about the city capital operating budget, and I appreciate you guys trying to balance everything, is that we feel our operating needs right now, and they're always pressing in on us. And yet at the same time, I think if we did the value calculations on any of the public goods that we use every day and think about the utility that people have gotten from the Boston Public Library Central Branch since it was built. I mean, the benefits compared to the cost of borrowing and building it back then it's just astronomical. And so whenever I think about that, I find myself saying, we got to do more capital because, and frankly, we use buildings in this town for a hell of a lot longer than their sort of natural life, quote unquote. And so I just, I'm always kind of wanting us to push in that direction. And the last thing I'll say, just to Councillor Mejia's question, or she's not on, so I'll tell her offline about the BHA. But yeah, the BHA's I think had some pretty decent success on the procurement side that I can talk to her about the procedures for. So thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Braden.
This is probably not the forum, but one thing that we face with all the new development that's transit oriented is that in terms of business, here in Alston Brighton, we're seeing a lot of biotech companies coming in, and they're asking us to put in thousands of new parking spots so that folks can commute in from the out from the suburbs. And we're saying no, and they're getting very upset because we're saying no to building all this. So I really feel there's a real, for me, frustrating in terms of talking about green bonds and green infrastructure. It's really frustrating for us that there's such a disconnect between what we are aspiring to as a city and trying to plan for as a city to mitigate the impacts of climate change, while at the state level, things seem to be going the opposite direction with regard to investment in transit and the MBTA, etc. So I think I'm just using this moment to vent, but it's a really, really frustrating thing. And sometimes I wonder if the city had more control over some of this, if we could do a better job, even in terms of a local transit system that uncouples itself from the MBTA, if we could do a better job. And then to the point that, all this excessive traffic coming in from the suburbs and further west is destroying our air quality in neighborhoods like Chinatown that are right next to the pike, so that's my vent. It's more of a comment than a question, but it is an issue of great frustration to folks out here. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Braden. Any comments from the team?
Councillor, I know you mentioned water and sewer earlier, and I know that they are thinking a lot about sort of permeable space and parking spots and all of that. So that's certainly maybe a good avenue to sort of think more about, what the options are. So I'm happy to engage with them and follow up with you if that would be helpful.
Thank you, Emma. That would be wonderful. Thank you. And Madam Chair, that's all the questions I have for now. Thank you.
And sorry, Madam Chair.
Go ahead, Councillor Bach.
Councillor Braden, we did have the water and sewer came to Councillor Wu and Mai's other hearing on the Conservation Corps and talked about a bunch of their kind of capital plan on that front, and the fact that because they're under this EPA order, I think there's opportunity to scale up there. So I do think they're thinking along those lines substantially, and we can nudge them further, and there's an opportunity for further collaboration with the city.
Water and sewer, I think we're on the same page with water and sewer. We just need to get the MBTA on the same page as us. But that's another story. Thank you. And I know you know about that, Councillor Bach. Thank you.
Thank you. So the only other point, I will underscore Councillor Bach's push around public resources for housing and the ability to combine all the things that we're talking about today and see a lot of savings in the long run for residents and for the city. I guess the only thing I had additionally was if you could all just really get sort of one level of detail into what our bond rating signifies, sort of like, quantifying what is the difference between AAA plus, AA plus in terms of the difference in rates, interest rates that we would see over a period of time, et cetera, and how that and then how much the debt limit or the percentage factors into that bond rating as one of multiple factors, et cetera.
Yeah, I'm going to let Drew take the interest rate question. I'll just say at a high level, certainly we talk a lot about the bond rating. I know every year it comes up as we talk about budget. And it is very much an important metric for us, partially because certainly of the rates that it achieves for us. But I think on a larger sort of lens, it is important because it's really a report card for us in terms of understanding whether we are managing the city's finances in the most responsible way possible. And I think we have been fortunate to receive a positive report card for many, many years. So for me, the interest rate savings are certainly important, although, they are certainly not in the realm of savings that I think would even allow us to achieve some sort of large new capital project because of the avoided cost. So I guess I would just stress that the bond rating is first and foremost important for us because it is a good mirror and reflection back to us about whether we are choosing sort of the right path forward and things like pension obligations, long-term liabilities like OPEB, affordable debt service, et cetera. And so it's sort of a sum of many parts and really gives us a good pulse for how the city is managing. Drew, do you want to say anything more about that or about and specifically answer the councilor's question about savings?
Sure, I can try, Councilor. The difficulty here is that there's a lot of variance between one AAA and another AAA. The city of Boston that only comes once a year and is considered a relatively infrequent issuer, although a regular one, we're going to command a lower rate of interest than a AAA credit that, all things being equal, comes 6 times a year. And so a lot of it comes into supply and demand. It's difficult to say. What I will say, a pretty good approximation of things is, we always price against the MMD curve. And, the MMD curve approximates what a AAA rated bond vanilla should bring in the market. And then everyone kind of scores themselves against that. Boston did very, very well this time around with AAA pricing flat against the curve on the back end. Now, if your question is around, well, how much does having a AAA save you versus having a AA plus? I think that it would be nearly impossible to quantify from an interest rate perspective because it will be different for whoever you ask. I think that Emma's exactly right when she says that there's a lot more value to maintaining a AAA than simply the interest savings associated with it. It is a good indicator of where we are in getting our pension obligations taken care of. Frankly, more importantly now than ever, where we are with handling climate change mitigation issues and where they see us going over the next 5, 10, and 20 years.
So just to give, I'm not asking this to
Sure.
hold anybody accountable to any projections or anything like that. Just to give a sense of scale, right? And I know, lots of different factors for Boston, given everything, holding everything else sort of equal about the rest of the factors that go into the bond rating. If Boston were at AA, what do you like? What sort of scale of savings does that represent?
If we were at AAA versus AA? Counselor, and I'm not trying to be evasive here. It's just that if I give you an answer, it's not going to be a good one and it's not going to be an accurate one because it depends on a lot of different things. It would be difficult to say. Does it mean that, does a AAA save you? So in this last transaction, for example, we priced flat against the curve. If we had a AA, does that mean we're going to price 50 basis points over the curve? No. So maybe that gives you some kind of skill, but let me just tell you something. Pricing 50 basis points above the curve is a terrible result. So maybe that's not giving you that much information, but it would just be really difficult for me to say.
Okay, thank you. Okay, any other questions from my colleagues? We're good. I know we have, we want to hear from a few folks who are signed up to testify. Let me just make sure in the waiting room. Okay, let's start with Frank O'Brien, then Ben Bradlow. Frank, are you still there? You're muted right now. Okay, we'll circle back in a little bit. Ben, would you like to speak? Welcome.
Sure. Thank you, Councilor Wu, and to all of the councilors and panelists. My name is Ben Bradlow, and I'm a comparative social scientist of urban governance and inequality, currently as a postdoctoral fellow at Harvard's Weatherhead Center for International Affairs. I was very happy to learn that the Boston City Council was holding today's important hearing on green and social bonds. Simply put, the need to use all tools at the city's disposal to help its most excluded residents could not be more urgent. And the best way to do this is to take advantage of the fiscal space available to the city, as Councilor Wu was alluding to in her questions just now, by virtue of its strong credit position, as well as changing credit conditions both nationally and globally, which are associated with the financing specifically of green infrastructure. There are 2 points that I want to emphasize. First, that the social and environmental goals of investing in green infrastructure can be mutually reinforcing. This can create a virtuous circle of municipal finance deployment that would make the process of decarbonization an overwhelming structural opportunity for the city. And second, that the city has significant degrees of untapped fiscal space with which to take advantage of this otherwise theoretical opportunity. So what do we mean by green infrastructure, and why is this so important? Green infrastructure is not only the kind of infrastructure that helps to mitigate the effects of climate change. Rather, cities are increasingly recognized as the front lines of what climate scientists call adaptation. That is, cities are not only dealing with the effects of carbon, they can lead the way towards a transition from carbon. Foremost among these adaptation strategies is what's widely recognized as one of the most pressing social and economic challenges that's facing the city of Boston, which is housing. Buildings account for approximately 40% of carbon emissions globally, with a similar share of emissions associated with buildings nationally in the United States. Especially over the past decade, Boston has undergone a building boom, which should also be understood as a carbon boom. This has largely been associated with increasing economic and racial inequality and a deepening crisis of housing affordability. It's therefore incumbent on the city to anyway make significant investments in the provision of affordable housing well beyond the current scale, as many of the councilors have alluded to today. Fortunately, the inclusion of housing investments in a broader portfolio of public green investment would be of particularly low risk in financial terms, while also serving to undo the profound residential inequalities that characterize Boston today. When pooled with riskier large infrastructure projects, the choice to invest in green housing will mean blending in safe and comparably predictable returns. My point here is not that adding affordable housing investments to the mix does not cost money. It does. But rather, my point is that it's an investment that is unusually predictable. This reduced risk profile would make issuing bonds for a portfolio of projects that includes affordable green housing particularly attractive. Green housing investments could include the construction of new homes on the basis of design standards that insulate, heat, and cool using all-electric renewable technology. These standards not only reduce the carbon footprint of new homes, but they provide significant savings to residents in the form of lower utility payments. Further, green housing investments could finance the retrofitting of residences with electric appliances, heating, and cooling systems. The spillover benefits are enormous. First, public investment in these projects would incentivize construction trade unions to mainstream expertise in these building standards among their workforce and training programs. The expanded work opportunities in green affordable housing, if led by strong municipal public investment, would make the trades particularly strong stakeholders in backing such a program. Second, such a program of public investment in housing would enable the city of Boston to make use of its significant fiscal space to address the core social priority of housing insecurity that afflicts so many of the city's residents. I want to end by noting that there's a sea change in economic policy making at the national level from which the city of Boston can both learn and take forward. This change can be summed up in what the Biden administration now refers to as the fundamental connection between, quote, physical infrastructure and, quote, human infrastructure. The mere fact of this hearing underscores the need for the city of Boston to make use of all of its financial resources to produce a transformation that meets the social and environmental challenges of our time. And the expansion of green and social finance is a much needed step in that direction. Putting green affordable housing at the center of the portfolio of projects to be supported by such finance would put the city of Boston on a path that's responsive to both its fiduciary responsibilities and its social goals. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, any further? Oh, I don't see Frank anymore, so I think that will conclude. I'll go to Kenzie for any final comments, and then we'll wrap.
just to thank you, Madam Chair, for calling this, and to thank you, Chief Handy, and to Drew and Justin for being with us, and especially thanks also to Professor Levy. And I think the presentation you gave, giving the kind of context for the urgency of this, was really helpful for everyone watching at home. And I know that this municipal finance is it's a little bit in the weeds, and yet I think it's really critical to a lot of the biggest picture challenges that we're facing and our opportunity to really meet them aggressively. So excited to keep working with the Cheney administration on this, and and grateful again, Councillor Wu, for your leadership.
Thank you. I will echo the gratitude to everyone. Thank you, Professor. Thank you to the administration team, and I'm really excited to see the creativity that we're using to really step into the full use of municipal power and tackling the urgency of what we're facing. So we'll look to continue the conversation, but for now, this will conclude our hearing on docket number 0220, Green and Social Bonds. This hearing is adjourned.
Okay, thank you. Thanks.
Thank you for joining us. Have a great day, everyone.